All right, the next phyla that we're going to be talking about in upper invertebrates are arthropods, which means that they have jointed feet or legs. When we get to the arthropods, we start seeing even more diversity within the phylum. Um, we saw a lot of different diversity in mollusks, but it's even going to be a greater diversity with arthropods. So the characteristics tend to be very general because we're talking about a large group of organisms. At this point, they all have bilateral symmetry. They have a tough exoskeleton. That exoskeleton is typically made from a protein and a carbohydrate. And the carbohydrate that's typically found in that exoskeleton is called chitin. They often will molt or shed, and we'll talk more about that in a few slides. They have a segmented body. That number could differ, but you're going to find that there's either 2 segments or 3, depending on the class that we're talking about. And they have jointed appendages. That means they have legs, antenna, and mouth parts that extend from the body. Anytime we have a large diversity within the phyla of animals that we're looking at, we're going to see a large diversity in the way that they eat as well. So some arthropods are herbivores, some are carnivores, some are omnivores, some are bloodsuckers, some are filter feeders, some are detritivores, some are parasites. One of the things that they all have in common is that they have mouth parts that range from pinchers or fangs to sickle-shaped jaws that can cut through tissues of their captured prey. Those can be pretty malicious, and we'll talk more about those soon. How they breathe is also different. Some will use their body surface like we saw in most of the lower invertebrates. Some will have gills like we saw in mollusks. Some will have book lungs, and some will have tracheal tubes. Most of the terrestrial arthropods will breathe through a network of branching tracheal tubes, which are going to be precursors to our trachea. Air will enter and leave the tubes through spiracles, which are small openings that are found along the side of the body. Those openings are found in the exoskeleton. Other terrestrial arthropods, such as spiders, will respire using book lungs. These book lungs are organs that look like pages of a book stacked on each other. And by doing that, that increases the surface area to allow for maximum gas diffusion. However, the aquatic arthropods, like lobsters and crabs, they're going to use actual gills because they're in the water. And since we're from Maryland, we know when we dissect a crab, we can see the gills, and those are the parts that we don't typically eat. Most arthropods have an open circulatory system. What this means for them is that they have a well-developed heart. That heart's going to pump blood through arteries, and those arteries are going to branch until they enter the tissues. When the blood leaves the blood vessel, it moves into a sinus cavity, and in that sinus cavity, you're going to have mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, so it's not super efficient at diffusing the oxygen. The blood collects in those large sinuses, where then we use diffusion for gas exchange, and then it will leave the sinus and go back through blood vessels to get back to the brain. Get back to the heart, so that it can get more, pick up more oxygen along the way and take it back to the sinuses. The whole point of that is to get the gases that are needed to the cells and the gases that are waste, like carbon dioxide, away from the cells. And by doing that, by having that mixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, it's not as efficient as, say, your system. Arthropods have a really unique way of getting rid of nitrogen waste, and it's kind of fun to say. Terrestrial arthropods will actually dispose of their nitrogen waste using Malpighian tubules, which, who doesn't want to say Malpighian? It makes you sound smart. These Malpighian tubules are sac-like organs, and what it does is extract the nitrogen waste from the blood and allows it to be added to the feces. Our aquatic arthropods will still use diffusion for getting rid of nitrogen waste into the surrounding water. All arthropods have a brain, and that brain is going to serve as a central switchboard that receives incoming information and sends out outgoing instructions to muscles. They have two nerves that encircle the esophagus and connect the brain to the ventral nerve cord. And along this nerve cord, there are several ganglia. And these ganglia create coordinated movements of the individual legs or wings. What's really kind of cool is because of this system, the advancements in this nervous system, some wings of some insects do not need to get a signal for every time the wing flaps. They'll just continue to flap without an immediate signal, which is really kind of fascinating. Most arthropods have sophisticated sense organs like compound eyes or taste receptors, and that also is part of that nervous system. Well, we all know that the creepy crawly insects, they are very good at moving around. Arthropods have well-developed groups of muscles. Those muscles are coordinated and controlled by the brain and the receptors all along the organism. Muscles are made up of individual muscle cells that will contract when they're stimulated by the nerves. So this is very similar to how your movement is coordinated. Muscles generate force by contracting and then pulling on the exoskeleton. Again, our skeleton's inside, but that's essentially what happens to move our skeleton is the nerve is stimulating the muscle causes a contraction, and that contraction of the muscle pulls the skeleton. Pulls on the muscle against the exoskeleton allow the arthropod to beat their wings to allow them to fly in the air, to push their legs against the ground to walk, or to beat their flippers against the water to swim. All right. So reproduction. When it comes to arthropods that live on land, they typically have internal fertilization. And please know that there's exceptions to every rule. In some species, the males have the reproductive organ that places sperm inside the females. In others, the male deposits a sperm packet, and that's picked up by the females. So even though it's sexual reproduction, it's not always involving sex. Aquatic arthropods, however, can have internal or external fertilization. The external fertilization obviously takes place outside of the female's body. It occurs when the female releases eggs into the environment, and then the males shed sperm around the eggs. And then they hope that somewhere in the water the two shall meet and make a baby. Since arthropods are such a large phyla of organisms, instead of studying different classes of arthropods, which there are a bazillion of, we're going to take a look at some subphyla of arthropods. The first subphyla we're going to look at are crustaceans. Crustaceans typically have two pairs of antennae, 2 or 3 body sections. They have chewing mouth parts called mandibles, and they have 5 pairs of legs. And this is where the things that we like to eat here in Maryland, the crabs, come into play. This is also lobsters, crayfish, and barnacles. The next subphyla are Chelicerata, and this is mainly spiders. When you think of it, think of spiders. Obviously, we could go further and get to arachnids where it's just spiders, but think of spiders when you think of Chelicerata. So Cheliceratates have 2 body sections. Nearly all of them have 4 pairs of walking legs and therefore have 8 legs total. They respire using book gills or book lungs, which are very similar, and that increases their surface area for gas exchange. Cheliceratates have 2 pairs of appendages that are attached to the mouth. So they're adapted as mouthpiece. One is the Cheliceratae, which are fangs that are used to stab and paralyze their prey, and the other is called the pedipalps, and these are longer and they're modified to grab the prey. Found in this subphyla are the horseshoe crabs that we see off the coast of Maryland, spiders, ticks, and scorpions. So Uniramia are the insects, centipedes, and millipedes. This subphyla contains more species than any other group of animal alive today. It is so diverse. Uniramians have jaws, they have 1 pair of antennae, and they have single branched appendages. So examples being centipedes, millipedes, and insects such as ants, bees, grasshoppers, stink bugs, you name it. Find it creepy crawly, it's probably part of this group. Insects have body divided into 3 parts. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. There are 3 pairs of legs, and all 3 pairs are attached to the thorax. So one of the characteristics is that they shed their exoskeleton. So we're going to talk about that now. That's done through a process called metamorphosis. This is a change in body form from egg to adult. And there's 2 types depending on the arthropod. It may go through complete metamorphosis or incomplete metamorphosis. All right, so in complete metamorphosis, there's 4 stages. The first stage is egg. The egg leads to larva, and that larva may be in the form of a caterpillar or a maggot or a grub. That will lead to the pupa stage, where the larva enters into either a cocoon or a chrysalis, and coming out of the cocoon or chrysalis, we have the adult. One of the advantages of complete metamorphosis is that the adults and the larva are not competing for food, so there's no trouble in sustaining the organism. Some examples of this include butterflies, flies, bees, beetles, fruit flies. These are all organisms that go through complete metamorphosis. On the other hand, there's incomplete metamorphosis, and that just goes through 3 stages. It goes from egg to nymph to adult. And in incomplete metamorphosis, the young look exactly like the adult. It just goes through several molts to reach this adult stage. So that includes, like, it just sheds its exoskeleton and develops into the next stage. This includes grasshoppers, crickets, dragonflies, and locusts. And we must be getting pretty close to the next time we're going to have a big locust event here in Maryland. It's coming soon, I know it. Arthropods play a pretty large role in the survival of humans. For instance, they pollinate flowers for production of fruits and other foods. So without them, we would lose a lot of crops. They provide food. For instance, honeybees provide honey, which we eat or use to make food. Some we eat directly. For instance, shrimp and crabs and lobsters, we eat those directly. Some people in some countries will eat other insects that I personally would rather not eat, but to each his own. We do get silk from silk moths. Some can be pests. They can bite, they can sting. Spiders and bees and wasps and scorpions all bite or sting. They can be vectors of disease, and what that means is that they can by biting you, they can infect you with a disease that they picked up from another organism. For instance, ticks can carry Lyme disease. So when you get bit by a tick, it can give you Lyme disease. Mosquitoes carry malaria, and the tsetse fly can carry African sleeping sickness. Some arthropods can destroy buildings. For instance, carpenter ants and termites can do a great bit of damage. And some are capable of really destroying crops. Boll weevils, flower beetles, corn borers, they can destroy up to 1/3 of a crop yield. So not so great, but without insects, we wouldn't have crops to begin with. So take the good with the bad. Hope you enjoyed this.